simply the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest day that shaped the Civil War. September 17, 1862, dawned cool and misty along a quiet creek in western Maryland. By nightfall, Antietam Creek would run red. In 12 hours of savage fighting, more Americans would fall than on any other single day in the nation's history. 23,000 men shot, bayoneted, or blown apart. One day that stopped Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North. One day that gave Abraham Lincoln the victory he needed to change the war's purpose forever. This is the story of Antietam, the bloodiest day America ever endured. The road to Antietam began with Confederate triumph. In the summer of 1862, the South was winning. Robert E. Lee had driven George McClellan's Army of the Potomac away from Richmond in the 7 days battles. He crushed John Pope at Second Bull Run. The Confederacy needed a knockout blow. Lee decided to carry the war north to Maryland, a border state teetering between Union and secession. A victory there might bring foreign recognition from Britain and France. It might force Lincoln to negotiate peace. On September 4, 1862, 50,000 ragged Confederates crossed the Potomac singing "Maryland, My Maryland." Lincoln had no choice but to restore McClellan to command. Little Mac was cautious to a fault, but his men loved him. On September 13th, fate handed McClellan the chance of a lifetime. A Union corporal found a copy of Lee's Special Order 191, wrapped around 3 cigars in an abandoned Confederate camp. The order detailed Lee's army split into 5 parts strung out across 40 miles. McClellan boasted, "Here is a paper with which if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." Yet McClellan hesitated 18 precious hours. By the time he moved, Lee had time to concentrate near Sharpsburg, behind Antietam Creek. Still, the Union commander held a clear advantage, 87,000 well-fed, well-armed troops against roughly 38,000 hungry Confederates. The stage was set for September 17th. The battlefield was a patchwork of cornfields, woodlots, and rolling hills. 3 bridges crossed the creek, east, middle, and lower. A sunken farm road cut across the center. A whitewashed Dunker church sat on a ridge. These places would soon have new names: the Cornfield, Bloody Lane, Burnside's Bridge. Fighting began at dawn in a 40-acre cornfield owned by David Miller. Union General Joseph Hooker's corps attacked. Confederate artillery tore gaps in the blue ranks. Men fired so fast the cornstalks were cut as if by a scythe. In 2 hours, the cornfield changed hands 6 times. One Iowa regiment went in with 600 men and came out with fewer than 100. By 10 a.m., nearly 8,000 men lay dead or wounded among the shattered stalks. South of the cornfield, Union troops slammed into the Confederate center along a sunken road worn deep by years of wagon traffic. For 4 hours, Southerners behind stone walls and split-rail fences poured fire into the Union waves. The dead piled so high, attackers had to climb over their own fallen to reach the road. A New York soldier wrote, "They died where they stood, and still the living came on." When a Confederate counterattack faltered, the line broke. Bloody Lane lived up to its name, 2,500 rebels and 3,000 Federals down in a strip barely 300 yards long. In the afternoon, the battle shifted south to a narrow stone bridge over Antietam Creek. Ambrose Burnside, ordered to force a crossing, spent 4 hours trying. 2 Georgia regiments held the far bank against overwhelming numbers. Finally, at 3 p.m., the 51st New York and 51st Pennsylvania charged across under murderous fire. They seized the bridge and pushed toward Sharpsburg. Victory seemed at hand. Then, in one of the war's great dramatic moments, the Confederate left wing arrived. A.P. Hill's Light Division had marched 17 miles from Harper's Ferry in 17 hours. Red calico still tied around their hats to mark them as friendly. They slammed into Burnside's flank. The Union advance collapsed. By dusk, the fighting sputtered out. Lee held the field, but barely. He had lost a quarter of his army. McClellan, with fresh divisions still uncommitted, could have renewed the attack the next day. He did not. On September 18th, Lee withdrew across the Potomac. The invasion was over. The numbers were staggering. Union losses: 12,410. Confederate: 10,316. Total: 22,726 in 12 hours. More than the American dead at Yorktown, Saratoga, and New Orleans combined. More than D-Day and 9/11 together. The single bloodiest day in American history. Yet, Antietam was a tactical draw that became a strategic Union victory. Lee's invasion failed. Maryland stayed in the Union. Britain and France withheld recognition of the Confederacy. Most importantly, Lincoln now had the victory he needed. 5 days later, on September 22, 1862, he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He had waited for a battlefield success, so the act would not seem desperate. Antietam gave it to him. On January 1, 1863, the final proclamation declared freedom for all slaves in Confederate-held territory. The war to preserve the Union became a war to end slavery. Hundreds of thousands of black soldiers would enlist. The moral stakes were transformed forever. Antietam changed everything. It saved the Union cause when it was on the brink. It ended any realistic hope of Confederate independence. It made emancipation the war's central purpose, and it left scars across the land. Clara Barton nursing the wounded under fire, earning her name Angel of the Battlefield. Matthew Brady's photographs of bloated corpses shocking New York gallery visitors into silence. Farmers plowing up bones and mini-balls for decades. Lee would never again take the offensive with such strength. McClellan's failure to destroy him cost him command. The Army of the Potomac would fight on, through Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, until Appomattox. But on that September day beside a quiet Maryland creek, the fate of a nation turned. One day of unimaginable slaughter bought the time, the will, and the moral clarity to keep the United States whole, and to begin the long, unfinished work of making it free. Antietam was not the war's biggest battle. It was not the war's decisive battle, but it was the day America bled most and changed forever. The sun rose on September 18th over a landscape from hell. Bodies lay so thick in the cornfield that one could walk across it without touching ground. Bloody Lane had become a trench of corpses, some stacked 3 deep. Surgeons worked without chloroform, sawing limbs, while men bit on bullets to keep from screaming. The air reeked of blood, gunpowder, and rotting corn. Farmers' wives carried water and bread to the wounded of both armies, unable to tell blue from gray anymore. Robert E. Lee stood on a knoll and waited for the attack he knew McClellan had the strength to deliver. He had 30,000 men left, many unarmed, some barefoot. Ammunition was nearly gone. If McClellan struck again, the Army of Northern Virginia would be annihilated. The Union commander had 25,000 fresh troops who had not fired a shot. He did nothing. By nightfall, Lee began pulling his battered army back across the Potomac. McClellan sent a cavalry patrol to watch, nothing more. Lincoln visited the battlefield 2 weeks later. He walked the ground where the Irish Brigade had been cut to pieces, where the Confederate dead still lay in rows along the Hagerstown Pike. He asked George McClellan point blank why he had not pursued and destroyed Lee. McClellan's reply was the same excuse he had used for a year. The enemy was too strong, his own men too tired. Lincoln relieved him of command on November 7th. Little Mac never fought again. The political earthquake came immediately. On September 22nd, 5 days after the battle, Lincoln called his cabinet together and read the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. He had drafted it in July but waited for a victory, so it would not look like an act of desperation. Antietam, however qualified, gave him that victory. The war was no longer simply about restoring the Union. It was now a crusade to end slavery. From that moment forward, every Confederate victory prolonged human bondage. Every Union advance moved the country closer to freedom. Black America heard the news and understood what it meant. Recruiting stations opened for United States colored troops. By war's end, nearly 180,000 black soldiers and sailors would serve, 10% of the Union Army. Their courage at Fort Wagner, Milliken's Bend, and Petersburg would prove the proclamation was not charity, but justice. Europe watched too. Britain and France had been on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy, needing Southern cotton for their mills. Antietam and the proclamation ended that hope. No European government could now intervene on behalf of a slaveholding rebellion. The blockade held. The Confederacy was alone. The battlefield itself became sacred ground. Clara Barton, who had brought wagons of supplies and worked through the night with lanterns tied to her wagon wheels, never forgot the horror. She would found the American Red Cross a decade later. Matthew Brady's exhibition, The Dead of Antietam, in New York, showed Americans' war as it truly was for the first time. Visitors wept in the gallery. One newspaper wrote, "Mr. Brady has done something to bring home to us the terrible reality and earnestness of war." The human stories are endless. The 15th Massachusetts went into the Cornfield with 606 men and came out with 284. The 1st Texas lost 82% of its strength in 15 minutes at the Cornfield, the highest casualty rate of any regiment in the war. Private David Thompson of the 9th New York remembered stepping over bodies so numerous it was like walking on pumpkins. Confederate nurse Kate Cumming wrote in her diary of amputated limbs piled like cordwood outside the field hospitals. Farmers near Sharpsburg found the ground so fertilized with blood that corn grew 12 feet high the next year. For decades, plows turned up bullets, belt buckles, and bones. The National Cemetery, established in 1865, holds 4,106 Union dead, many marked only unknown. Confederate dead were left where they fell until Maryland finally created a small cemetery for them in 1875. Antietam changed the war in ways no one could see that September day. It broke the aura of Confederate invincibility. It ended McClellan's career and brought forth new Union commanders who would fight instead of hesitate. It made emancipation the moral center of the conflict, and it taught both sides that this would be a war of annihilation, not negotiation. Lee would invade the North again at Gettysburg, but never with the strength or confidence he carried into Maryland. Lincoln would find his general in Ulysses Grant. The Union would fight on until slavery was dead and the nation reborn. One day, 12 hours, 23,000 casualties, a creek that ran red, a war that found its soul. That was Antietam.